Thank you guys for joining in. We're at episode number, I don't know what number it is, does it even matter? Uh, but tonight we have on a special guest. We have Cody Greenwood from the TradLab. We've been on here BSing a little bit before, and we should have recorded that because we were getting some good stuff, but probably would have offended a few people. That's okay.
That's what we do.
That's what we do. We're just,
If you don't, I'm telling you, if you don't have titties and tin rings, you got to offend people. That's the only
I
way you're
know,
gonna make it.
titties and tin rings. We need to make a shirt that says titties and tin rings.
That would be a good one.
I know. Can we can do a joint collab between TradLab and Timber Ninja because I think that fits my ethos.
That'll work.
Yeah. So Cody, thanks for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. You're getting ready for leave on a hunt tomorrow.
Yep, I'm going to go hit the antelope in South Dakota. I'll leave early in the morning, and of course, this is my normal routine: last minute sharpening and getting everything together. But the truck will get packed late tonight, and I'll be ready to go early in the morning.
So I have this thing that I do myself. Is the last minute sharpening needed for your arrows, or just something you like to do to like for an anxiety purposes?
I think I was asking, my wife asks me this all the time because she's an organizer, right? And she has a vested interest in me being successful. So she tries to help organize. The lab is very organized. I think it's just something to do with nervous energy.
Yeah.
Because I have razor sharp broadheads over here. But even when I get to camp, when there's nothing to do, I'll find something to sharpen, or I'll find a rope and practice tying. I'll be doing something. I'm forever trying to learn how to do a trucker cinch and haven't mastered it yet. So if I get bored at camp, I'm always doing knots or I'm sharpening something, but I think it's just something to do with nervous energy.
Yeah, me too. Cause like, I don't know if I get bored at night and I don't have anything else to do. Like I don't feel like reading or something like that. I don't watch TV. I'll just sit and I am a nerd about broadheads and arrows, and which is why I'm super stoked to have you on because you are that guy too. And so I have a bunch of broadheads and I'll just pass through the same broadheads at night, just with nothing to do. I'll just put a few strokes on them and just get them sharp or sharper than they were, or maybe I screw them up because I'm not the best at sharpening myself. But, and I was going to ask you some questions about that and we'll talk about that later, but,
sure.
So at Timber Ninja Outdoors, I personally, I've been a stick bow hunter for 4 or 5 years now. I'm passionate about it. It's the only way I archery hunt. And so I know about you through the TradLab because of traditional bow hunting. But for people we have followers that are compound guys, and I think your information really translates well from stick bow to trad bow, stick bow to compound. For anybody that doesn't know what TradLab is, can you give a quick synopsis of what is TradLab?
Sure. So for my profession is investigative analytics. So I went to school at Purdue, got done with school, and I worked for Whirlpool Corporation. So Fortune 100 companies, and I investigate root cause problems, and I report out to the executives what the problems are, and then we try to fix them. Then I moved to the railroad. Now what I do is I investigate railroad issues. Like whether it be reliability or what's causing things to go wrong or right. And then I come back with the facts and let the smart people choose the course of action. And like I told you, about 3 or 4 years ago, I finally got at a point in my career at school where I had some free time and I wanted to dive back into hunting and I wanted to give back to hunting. And what I see the most of, especially in trad, but it's also in compound, people will come in really hard and then they'll try it and then they leave. It's the best comparison that I give people is guitars. If you watch someone wants to learn how to play a guitar, they go buy a cheap guitar that's hard as hell to play. They try to play the guitar for about 3 to 6 months and then they quit. And then you lose them, right? And I'm trying to grow hunting, and we lose a lot of hunters in the compound space that I believe if they would transition to trad, they'd find what they loved about hunting again, just like I did.
Same here.
And I think if they would dive into that, they would be, because traditional archery is really for winners, meaning you got to be willing to take it on the chin over and over and over before you figure it out. But traditional archery has kind of been, to use another guitar analogy, kind of been the place where bassists go to hide. You wanted to play 6-string, but now are just bassists. That's changed over the last 5 years, where now you're starting to see guys that are actual hunters getting in the game. And just kind of to bring the excitement back, my entire goal was to try to go find the facts and leverage the analytics to develop the shortest path for someone coming out that's either brand new or coming out of compound to go, okay, I want to be a 10%er in this space. What do I need to pay attention to? And all of my studies have gone towards that learning curve. And I started 3 years ago, and my goal was to not be biased by propaganda or be paid for. And I've stuck to those guns. So I've spent all of my own money in doing these tests, and I try to give unfiltered results. And I try to study where the average opinion differs greatly from the 10%ers opinion. And I go study there to try to close that gap. And that's where all the controversy comes from typically, because you rarely see me aligning with the average opinion. I'm usually trying to find where there's gaps, and I focus there.
Nice. Yeah. And so obviously you have the background from an analytical perspective of this, but I think you and I both are on the same page. You see a lot of people getting into the YouTube market, podcast market, social media market without a lot of experience in the realm of what they're actually talking about. They just essentially regurgitate stuff they've heard from other people. And all of a sudden, if they have a good following, they're become industry experts. But
book reporters, I call them.
But you we were talking earlier. So tell you're based on trad based stuff, right? So what's the background on you as a trad hunter?
I started hunting when I was probably with my dad in the same tree, when I was really young, probably second grade or so. When I was in the third grade, I got my first bow, and it was a little kind of like a toy. It was not a toy, but it was a really lightweight bow. Around the fourth grade, I ended up getting to start practicing with a real bow. And my dad's rule, I'm an old man. So back then there wasn't trad. It was just archery. Compounds were like the bear whitetail too, right? Compounds weren't that much better than recurves back then. Mm-hmm. But my dad wouldn't let me learn how to use a sight until I learned how to shoot a bow. So at that point, I learned how to shoot a bow instinctively. And he focused a lot on form. And then later he let me go to a compound. And I moved back and forth I shot compounds like we shoot trad now. Like my first deer was actually in junior high. I was doing homework out of a tree stand, and I shot a doe with a bear whitetail 2 that I was shooting with fingers and instinctive, because that's just what you did. And every arrow out of my quiver fell out of my bow when I shot her. It was a fun deal, but that was my first doe, and I've been hunting ever since then. I moved to Michigan and lived in Southwest Michigan for about 12 years. And for about 12 to 15 years, I focused on my career, and I would hunt maybe 10 to 12 days a year. About 3 or 4 years ago, I got a point in my career where I didn't have to go to school anymore, and I got more time, and now I've come back full tilt into hunting, and I'm trying to push myself every year to go on harder and harder hunts. But I didn't start hard. I'm starting relatively easy and working my way up. But what I'm trying to do is be really open and honest about my own hunting ability. If I go on a hunt and I suck, I'll come back on a podcast and talk about how I blew it. Yeah. So that other people realize that that's pretty normal. We're not all Navy SEALs with traditional archery equipment out here killing everything.
Yeah.
And my goal is to be really transparent, because I really think the only way you're going to get better in this game is if you suck, you need to know it and you need to work on it. And then you need to go back out there. But I'm trying to drive that message home. I've been more successful than I thought, but I've gotten a lot of help over the last 2 or 3 years, because the first year is pretty rough. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of the backstory.
So we need to fix something. You're calling yourself an old man. I'm 42. You're 45. Mm-hmm. We're not old, technically.
Well, yeah.
We're wise. We're wise.
Wise. Old enough to know how ignorant we are.
Yeah, old enough. Yeah, exactly. So about how many hours of data do you think you've compiled? Because a lot of your stuff, I mean, you have it based on bows, but you spend a lot of time on arrows, broadheads. Tens of thousands.
Yeah. In the last 3 years, this is easily 20 to 30 hours a week. I mean, tens of thousands of hours. And I know I have almost about $70,000 wrapped up in it. And when I come out with a study, I say that it's courtroom ready. I treat these studies just like they were if they were for the railroad and there was a derailment or a major component failure. Mm-hmm. If I come out with a study, I've done the due diligence behind it that I could go to a court and I could win most court cases. So nice. I try to put, now my opinions aren't weighted. That's why I try to make sure I differentiate between opinion and fact, but I put a lot of effort into the work that I do.
Well, in the world of success, they say mastery is accomplished at the hours of 10,000, right? Like,
yeah, the Outliers book. Yeah.
Outliers. Yes. It's a great example. Kobe Bryant shot 10,000 shots before he was the best, basketball player and all these things. So, if you put that time in, you're borderline at a mastery level because you've done enough research and failures to understand like what works and what doesn't work. And, what would you say is the most common question that you get from people?
The most common question I get from people is probably the most common topic I get from people is typically broadheads. The only thing that I can assume is that there's more margin on broadheads than anything else, because based on all of the work that I've done, this is not the most important part of the entire system, but this is definitely the most popular part of the system that people want to talk about.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think this is my opinion, but I think this because this is how I think I was, because I don't have 10,000 hours in hunting. I have 10,000 hours in the analytics. I'm still learning how to be a better hunter. I've hunted for a long time, but I've only hunted to learn, if that makes sense, for the last 3 to 4 years. Like when I started TradLab, I thought I was a good hunter. TradLab led me to an opportunity where I could meet real good hunters. And I went, oh shit, I'm not a good hunter. There's a big difference between where I'm at now and where a 10%er is. So I'm trying to learn. I think people gravitate towards the broadhead because that's where marketing spends most of its time pointing towards, lethality, which gets overused over and over and over. And I know whenever I first got into trad, I read the Ashby files and I was all in. And all of my faith and confidence came from that research. So I didn't have, I was a glass cannon, if you will. I was all offense, right? I had no faith in my actual self as a trad hunter because I was relatively new to it, just coming back into it in 2015. But I had faith in that research. So I went with a really heavy arrow, 3-1, the whole bit, right? And I think people can kind of purchase confidence, even though it's kind of a house of cards. It's not really good confidence. But if you're new, you can buy the best equipment and it makes you feel like you've got a shot. I've learned since otherwise. And maybe that's not why everybody does it. That's why I did it. And that's the only thing I can infer. But I see people really wanting to wet sand on the broadhead and their arrows flying at a 40-degree angle downrange. And I'm like, there's not a broadhead made that's going to make you successful. You got to fix your form, your tune. And, the biggest problem in traditional archery, if you really pay attention, is people draw on a doe or a buck while it's looking at them because they get busted drawing. And then they try to make the shot and bad things happen, right? Because now it's not hunting, it's dodgeball.
Yeah.
But they want to talk about this. And I think it's very misleading, but that's easily the number one. And I've done the most research on this because that's what they want to talk about. But I also do research on the stuff that I think is important.
So how many broadheads do you feel like you've done tests on?
I really don't know. I just finished this weekend testing 28 broadheads for outdoor life.
Okay.
28 over a 3-week period. And I'm looking across the lab and I have 2 shelves full of, I have every major broadhead made. And I have push force equipment. I have everything there is to test them.
So in your broadheads, is it all fixed blade stuff or do you have mechanicals or both?
Now, because of the outdoor life study, I have mechanicals now as well that I've run through.
Okay.
And I'll start testing those and making that available because I think there's more. Traditional archery, oddly enough, like 3 to 5 years ago, used to be the place where myths grew. But now, for some reason, compounds are where the myths grow. And I think there needs to be some back-base work done on broadheads there.
Yeah. Yeah, I would think so. I mean, there's a lot of things. I've shot mechanicals over the years. I've had more spoofs with mechanicals than I have anything else because it's mechanical, right? There's something that can go wrong at any time. I mean, only thing that can go wrong with a fixed blade in my mind is the guy behind it, all things considered. But I'd like to hear that from you. Like, As you've done these tests on broadheads, have you noticed significant changes between 3-to-1 ratio, 3 blade versus 2 blade, single bevel versus double bevel, any of that stuff? Like all things considered, if they're all the same sharpness. And we asked a lot of listener questions. So instead of just walking through listener question versus listener question, I'm going to try to like blend them in with our conversation here. So that was something that we talked about, or we had a lot of questions on, like for instance, one was 2 blade versus 3 blade, all things considered equally, which one has the less push force?
Yeah. So I'm going to refer to my data here because you're asking a question that requires some numbers. I think the actual question I saw online was a bear razor head, and I only have 2 bear razor heads, and they belong to my dad that he gave to me. So I'm not going to test those. I'm going to save those one of these days and sharpen them and hopefully kill some animals with them. But I took those bear razor heads and I compared them to a few other profiles, very close to a Zwicky, very close to a Stinger buzz cut, without bleeders, of course. So here I have some push force data in terms of pounds to go through a very, very thin layer of hair and a 1/16 of an inch of vinyl leather placed over a foam block that has the density similar to your quad if you were standing. And so before I get into the results, let me just give my little overlay here. It's impossible for anyone to simulate a live animal. You see these guys with like meat and they're poking holes in the meat and they're measuring the force. That's loose meat. That has no tension in it. There's a big difference in force requirement between your quad when you're standing and your quad when you're laying down. I give myself a shot once a week in my leg, and there's a massive difference in the force required and the pain when I'm standing versus laying down. So there's no perfect way for me to simulate an animal, and we won't even talk about movement because that changes everything.
Right.
So what I do is I use a broad array of media that has characteristics of the animal, but that I can repeat, and then we can compare across the board. So when I tell you that a Magnus Stinger takes 24.5 pounds, that doesn't mean it's going to take 24.5 pounds on an animal. If I take my force instrument in the field with me and I push it through like in between the ribs, it's actually, you can do it with your fingertips. It's like 3 or 4 pounds. If you go through scapula, it would go up 15 to 20 pounds. And then if you get on a like large boar, it goes way up there. But in the media that I use here, that's designed to simulate a boar's hide and their really, really coarse hair, a Stinger is 24.5 pounds of force. And I think what was the other? He just said a
3 blade.
3 blade. So like a day 6 is 34 point. Well, go ahead.
Well, like a 3 blade, like let's say like a VPA or
okay. So 30 pounds for a Montec, 24.5 pounds for a Stinger. And it's counterintuitive, but I'll explain it to you because you'll be able to see this. Maybe you can re-explain it so it makes sense. What you want to look at on a broadhead, this broadhead I have in my hand is a Woodsman Blood Groove. It's made by BPA. It's sold by Three Rivers. And what's really great about this head is it requires less push force than some 2 blades, but it's a 3 blade. And the reason that it requires less push force is because it doesn't have any surface area on it except for the very back here that's not cutting. And all that people have to remember whenever they look at a broadhead, this broadhead in the latest test required the less push force of all of them, including a 2 blade, and it has bleeders. It's the iron will. An iron will is always cutting. It's never pushing. Right. The surface area on this iron will has edges on it everywhere. The surface area, this is one of the best push force 3 blades right here. This Blood Groove from Three Rivers. It doesn't have any surface area where it's pushing hair through hide. It's cutting all the time. And that drastically reduces force. That same test where I put hair over something around the same density as like a firm quad, you wouldn't believe how many broadheads fail and just push a wad of hair through there and spike up to 145 pounds of force because they're not cutting, they're pushing.
And those are all sharpened to the same sharpness, correct?
I measure sharpness using the best method, which is the industry method for knives.
Okay.
Where I'll take out of the box sharpness, then I'll take all the broadheads to a max sharpness, and then I compare it. So in this test that I'm referring to, it was out of the box sharpness.
Nice.
And sharpness does matter. I don't do shit out of the box. Everything I get these stones are more expensive than the broadheads I use, and that's for a reason. I take them up to hair shaving, comfortable hair shaving like your face.
Yeah.
And that reduces force quite a bit. this head that everyone thinks is a terrible head for traditional archers.
That's a wasp, right?
It's a wasp hammer from like the 90s. They still make it. If I sharpen this tip, just the flat chisel tip, like you just saw me doing, I was sharpening this tip prior to starting, it cuts the force in half. And this blade out of that 28 broadhead test would have taken third place, and it cost $10.
Yeah. And because the hair also dulls the blade a lot. If you're dealing with a heavier, like a bear, for instance, if you're dealing with a bear versus like an antelope, you're going to have less issues with penetration because it's going to be sharper going in, correct?
Hair is the enemy, right? Because if your broadhead tries to push that hair through the meat, we've all opened up animals where you find hair inside the animal. It's time to either get your broadhead sharper or change broadheads. You want, when the deer leaves and you look back at where your shot was, if you don't see a hair grenade, you don't see hair floating around, your broadhead's not sharp enough. And that you want your broadhead cutting versus pushing that hair. It takes a ton of force. If you take your broadhead and you look at it after you've shot and there's hair wedged, that takes a lot of force as well. It's the key is cutting for us low energy guys.
Yeah.
You know, a compound hunter with 70, 80 pounds and a perfectly tuned arrow, stick a golf ball into your damn arrow and run it through. I mean, I mean, I don't understand what the problem is or why there's even anything to talk about. I mean, that's a lot of power.
Right.
I mean, I'm passing through bison with 48 pounds, passing through them.
Yeah.
With a recurve. I don't know what's going on in the compound world, but these guys should be zipping through everything they see.
Yeah. Well, you know, you're talking about the tenseness of an animal. And I've had that on my own theory about that for a number of years. And it's the reason I don't stop animals before I shoot them. I let them stop naturally, or I shoot them a little bit walking, because I don't want to be tense. If you do the bat, you know, they're going to stop and they're like, what is that? And they're going to be tense. Right. And it's harder to get through. It's like you punch me or you punch a person that's relaxed, they're going to get knocked out a lot easier than a person that's biting down on their mouthpiece. Right. I mean, it's just, and so I would say that translates over very well in the hunting world too, when in the real life scenario, when it counts. Like, but I don't think people were bleating at animals until they started seeing people doing it on videos.
No, I think I told you before we started recording, the biggest mistake most trad hunters make, I think, is shooting at an animal that's already seen them. We get busted drawing. The first thing you have to learn as a trad hunter is when to draw. Because you get busted drawing all the time, unless you're planning for it. And I think a lot of guys draw, they get busted, and they still try to make the shot, and bad things happen because animals drop, spin, roll. If I take the same media that we just talked about, and I hang one of my 45-pound plates off of it, and I hang it from a beam so that it's moving, I get a quarter of the penetration. Anything that gives, just like rolling off of a hook, you don't get hurt as bad as taking it, right? And people just have to remember that how the animal behavior is a bigger factor than anything I'm holding in my hand.
Exactly. Yeah, and that changes a lot, and how close you get them and everything. Out of all your broadhead tests, like from your quantitative data, what have you found to be the most all around? I mean, most of our follower base here are whitetail hunters, right? And what would you say is like one of the best all around whitetail broadheads?
On any budget, like money's not a problem?
Yes.
Iron will wide. I mean, I'm shooting with 44 pounds. I shot through that really big black bear with iron will wide and passed through it. What I want people to now, if you don't have a budget, I hate saying iron will because it's the most expensive head, but it does the best.
And you're not paid by Iron Willed, right?
No, hell no, I'm not paid.
Okay. I just want to clarify that we're not
I'm
like,
not paid by any. I'm paid by my wife and the railroad. That's what I'm paid by. My wife is my hunting sponsor. No, I'm not paid, but I do like Bill and respect Bill. He has applied actual mechanical physics to his design, and it shows. It really does. But what I don't want people to think is that you have to go spend that kind of money on broadheads. I can take a $12 broadhead, put some elbow grease into it, spit on some stones, get it sharp, and do really well. What I want people to remember is, I think the Ashby Foundation has done a lot of great things for hunting, but one thing that they've kind of sold us on is penetration, and pass-throughs. Pass-throughs don't kill. Lacerations kill. So I've been hunting hogs all year, all summer, and I open these hogs up and I count the lacerations going through the animal. Lacerations kill an animal. Not ice picks don't kill an animal. Blades kill the animal. I can't tell you how many pigs I've recovered because I nicked an artery a quarter of an inch, or I nicked something critical just a little bit. So a multi-blade head, people need to get away from these 2 blades. If they have the energy, get a 3-blade, get it razor sharp, make sure it doesn't have a giant ferrule on it, because that will actually take less force to go through than a 3-to-1 with a giant ferrule on it and a really dull tip. I mean, that's what I would like to get across to people, is that lacerations kill. And if you were to follow that laceration path through the animal, like if you're, the people that listen do this, you would think like when you hit, you're like, oh, I bet I hit a liver. You would be surprised and I don't expect people to do it, but if you take that animal apart, how many organs are not where they should have been when you hit? This is a theory or an opinion, but I think when there's an impact, your organs move away from the ribs and your arrow goes through. And I'll follow that path all the way through these hogs and go, where the hell was the lung? The lung should have been here. The liver should have been here. But the only thing that I can imagine is whenever there is that impact, your organs move away. And then I started pulling these hot, warm organs out and doing push tests on them. And what I noticed, unless you have a tip that's sharp and cutting, the force to cut is often greater than the force to move the organ out of the way. If you take your arrow the next time you open up a deer and you take that lung material, push some air into the corner of it, and push your broadhead by, you'd shit when you see how much stuff slides around that head.
Is that because it's not sharp?
Unless they're razor sharp, it takes more force to cut than it does to move the damn organ out of the way, especially on an animal that's rolling and turning. That's my theory. But what is a fact is when I open these damn pigs up, organs that should have been there aren't cut. And something right behind them is cut. So organs do shift. We think this is just packed hard full of stuff. That's a shifting mass. God knew what he was doing when he created these critters. Yeah. And you don't always hit what you think you hit. So having a sharp head that cuts is key.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Like if when you reach into an animal to pull their organs out, how quickly they move away from you. Like, so that makes sense. If you have a broadhead that's not sharp, it's going to push because they're so easy to move, and it's going to not cut and glance. So is it more important for the blades to be sharp or the tip to be sharp?
It's both. So the tip, I'm going to use the wrong term when I say catch it, but like in this case, you saw me sharpening this tip on flat stone. The tip has to kind of capture it, but it's not enough. In my test this weekend, I saw a lot of heads that had sharp tips, but the cutting edge right behind it wasn't sharp, and then it starts pushing. So you really need that perfect blend, and that's where kind of Iron Will got it figured out. He has a sharp tip that immediately starts cutting, right?
That's a Tonto tip, right? You know what they call that?
That's a Tonto tip. And what he basically has here is he has a chop angle up top, and then it goes to a slice angle behind it. So the moment that's entering the animal, it's going to catch most of everything it comes in contact with and cut it and slice, versus a head that might have a dull point. I don't have any here because I'm hunting with all these, but this tip catches the liver. Livers are really snotty and easy to get out of the way. Hearts stay still. They're firmly in place. You catch a heart, you're going to cut it. Lungs and livers are kind of snotty and they move around, but you need to be able to capture it. And then you need that tip to start cutting. And then you need the blades razor sharp so they're not moving it out of the way. And if people were to we're all ecstatic when we get that animal down, especially with pigs. I'm rolling around, opening a pig up with lice all over it, and it's 100 degrees trying to figure out what happened. I don't expect people to do that. But if you just look at your deer and you follow that path of laceration through the organs, you'll be shocked to see how many times a lung should have been cut and it wasn't.
Yeah.
And whenever you start really studying how animals die, they die through lacerations, not through pinholes.
Right.
So I try to use a multi-blade head, and I try to make sure that it's absolutely face shaving sharp. When I say sharp, it means you can comfortably shave your face. And my blood trails have improved, and I think a broadhead's going to do everything it can do for you if you have it in that condition.
So while we're talking about sharpening, I know one of our listeners had posed the question, the difference between sharpening with a file versus else. And he said he's been sharpening all of his heads with a file since we all landed on this planet, and he's killed everything under the sun. I think
I'm sure he has. Yeah.
I think you know who we're talking about.
Yeah. And I think if you're shooting anything through the lungs, you're going to have pretty good results. But if you cut, anybody that's worked for a living has cut themselves many times. Cutting your face bleeds more than tearing your flesh. Like when you're trying to break a screw loose and you tear your knuckles up, right?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't bleed that much.
Yeah.
Whenever you nick yourself on the face, you can't get the sumbitch to quit bleeding, right?
Yeah.
And I can't remember the medical terms behind how your body reacts to those type of cuts, but it has been proven, and it is a fact, that razor sharp is more effective than somewhat dull. And somewhat dull requires more force to cut than to move out of the way. Having said that, and I always end up with this argument. People ask me what's best. Indians killed shit with rocks. So, I mean, you can kill something with, I wouldn't let Chris Brino shoot me with a dull Zwicky 20 yards away. I would not do it because it's lethal. It
hurt really bad too.
I would die, right? If nothing else, of tetanus. But it's better to have a sharp head. And I get baited into these conversations. People don't ask me what average is. They ask me what best is. And then they give me, an example like that. And I can't win that debate. You can kill deer with dull ass heads. But if you were to kill 1,000 deer and another guy would kill 1,000 deer with razor sharp heads, he would have better recovery than you would. Mm-hmm. So that's the bottom line.
Well, and one thing, a guy, and I don't know how true this is. This is like me explaining some folklore, but talking about Indian heads, like I say, an obsidian type head, right? They say that surgical blades don't have a perfect edge. It's right. Kind of like a flint knapped head where it's a little bit serrated microscopically. Is there truth to that?
Yeah, I've read the same thing you have, but the key there is they're 3 to 5 molecules wide.
Okay.
So they're still razor sharp. You know right. What I mean? If you meet if you go get your balls nipped and he wants to use a dull razor, pay him extra money and videotape the procedure. You'll be rich on YouTube.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. Like I've spent time butchering. I used to own a farm and butcher my own pigs and everything. And I've spent a lot of time behind a knife. I've butchered a lot of animals. And also I'm in safety for a living. And most of my career has been in hand protection. So I understand like lacerations pretty well. And one thing you notice when you're cutting with a dull knife is it starts to grab and it pulls meat. Mm-hmm. Yeah, whereas a sharp knife just goes right through it. And so it makes perfect sense, especially when you're dealing with these, with an animal and pushing through organs that are moving out of your way. If they're sharper, and that's kind of why the multiple rubber band thing kind of makes sense, right? When you
open that test
and you push it through and it pops all of them.
This sounds rednecky as hell, but take those and cover them in olive oil.
Oh.
And shove heads through there. And that's very similar to what I'm doing every summer with hogs. I mean, it's almost that same texture, and you put olive oil over them to make them real snotty and slippery, and see if your head's still popping them. Because a vein, that main artery that runs through those hogs, is very similar to that test you're talking about. And I'm telling you right now, if you hit that vein on a hog, you're going to have recovery. But if you don't, and you hit one lung, you're going to be tracking blood for 500 yards for nothing most of the time.
So it really does it matter between a 3-to-1 ratio head versus a 2-blade, single bevel, double bevel, or whatever? Sharpness is key to cutting organs. Is that what we're originally coming up to?
Sharpness, tip design, and in terms of total push force, this will require less. This is a 3-blade wasp hammer. This will require less push force than a 3-to-1 2-blade. This is a BPA 3-blade. This requires less push force than a 3-to-1. Think about a 3-to-1. They're gigantic. They have a really dull tip, right? And they have a gigantic ferrule. That ferrule is not cutting; it's pushing. And,
are you saying gigantic in diameter or length?
Diameter and length. I mean, the ferrule is the size of it. It's 2364 11/32 for wood arrows. Mm-hmm. And that gigantic ferrule you're pushing through versus when you look at this, there's no ferrule. It's all blade. Mm-hmm. So just look at the surface area of the broadhead and say, how much of this broadhead is not cutting versus cutting? And cutting is, if you're not cutting, you're pushing. Pushing requires force.
Gotcha.
It's just like processing an animal with a dull knife. You know how much harder the work is versus when your knife is sharp. That's what I want people to think of.
Yeah. And you had mentioned the iron wheel's been the best that you've tested overall, like for your data, correct? I mean, you feel it's one of the more lethal. So what differs between that head and then there's others on the market now that are very similar, right?
Yeah. So like I just tested the Day 6, which is a top quality head, great steel. And it actually proved one of my theories wrong. I thought the Day 6 would beat this thing because the Day 6 has ferrule bleeders in the front of the ferrule.
Mm-hmm.
My theory was that would cut and make room for the ferrule, because these ferrules, they take force to move through because they're not cutting.
Mm-hmm.
And I was surprised to find it, but whenever I compare them side by side, the ferrules forward do require more force than ferrule. The bleeders forward do require more force than bleeders rear. And that was the biggest differentiator. The Day 6 came in third place, but in terms of push force, but that was why. And the Day 6 was actually sharper. Still came and find it. So
are you thinking that ferrule on the front is starting to push and stretch that material to where it cuts when it hits those blades in the back? It's really as simple, because I redid the test so I could watch it and see where the force was coming from. It's really just as simple as the main blade is creating openings that by the time the extra cutting force of the bleeders get there, it's already created an opening for them, versus bleeders up front. It's kind of hitting them all at once and slowing it down.
It's slowing, and you can watch the spike occur in the instrument as it hits the bleeders. That's the big differentiator. But we're talking about, I mean, when you're comparing a Day 6 at like 34 pounds versus 25.8 pounds, right? Versus a cutthroat 2 blade at 51 pounds. And that's through this media that I'm using that simulates a wild boar's bristly hair and like a tar back behind a bristly surface. That if this thing's not cutting it, now it's going to shove that coarse hair through that membrane. So it really punishes. But I mean, they're all very, very close together. But yeah, this ends up being better than ferrules forward. And that's the separator between the Day 6 and the iron wheel.
Well, and we have, we both are buddies with Isaac and them over at Vector. They have a new head coming out that's similar to that design. And it's more of a concave, right?
Yeah, it's very nasty. Yeah. That's based on the concept of the laceration path, the sum of laceration that I spoke to you about. When we did the public data study, so everyone that submits, and I would encourage all your listeners, if they get kills, to please submit them to me so I can enter them into my database. Everyone submits their kills to me, and I analyze, trends. And there was a lot of really good data that came out of that collective knowledge. But one of them was, the old Simmons Broadhead.
Yeah.
The Simmons Broadhead, that old thing, man, that puts blood on the ground.
It does.
And so there's something to that shape that kicks out of the back that's really opening up those lacerations and catching those organs. And I think they're grasping onto that. And they also did a lot of work on the ferrule. So their ferrule is real skinny. That thing actually requires very, very, very little push force and has a ton of cutting surface area on it.
Yeah.
And it's a nasty little head.
Yeah. I've killed animals with 2 concave style. One was the Kudu Point and the other's the Simmons. And I've had really good luck with both of those. What makes that angle different, though? Because I've noticed you do somewhat like the short. Yeah, there it is.
And then they give you 2 options for bleeders based on your energy level. I mean, look how wide those bleeders are. It's terrifying.
Yeah. And they're concave as well, right?
Yeah. The only thing I can think of, I'm speaking out on the edge of my knowledge here, but if you're trying to cut something, that concave shape certainly catches material and cuts better than a straight edge, right? And I think as this is going through and it's moving, and see, they have a sharp point that's cutting as well. So if this is going through and organs are moving out of the way, I think it's catching them and cutting them very, very, very well. And the Simmons just showed that in the public data, that here's one that's put together. And I think it's just going to catch and cut more, and it's going to create more laceration, is my theory. And if you look at their ferrule is trimmed down, so it's not pushing. It's barely there. So this thing is cutting. Most of its surface area is dedicated to cutting, and it's very, very, very nasty. And it requires very little force.
And people that aren't going to watch this on YouTube, a concave head essentially curves out away from the head. Is that a good explanation? It's not a straight angle.
Right.
So Yeah, that makes sense that it would start putting a steeper angle to start cutting instead of letting stuff pass over it. Would that be like
they start at a slice and they move to a chop.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I think it's going to be very, very effective. I haven't killed any animals with it yet. I'll use it this whitetail season. I'm trying to get some data on a few other designs for another company right now, but that's going to be a nasty little head. And the sum of laceration, from what I expect to see that sum of laceration to go up. And the only thing that correlates with recovery is lacerations, not penetration.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, in that regard, though, killing laceration results in better killing, better than penetration. But I've always, and debunk me here, I've always felt that 2 holes makes better blood trails than 1 hole.
I definitely think 2 holes make better blood trails than 1. There's no doubt about it. If I can get penetration, I want it. But what we're finding, if you design a broadhead around optimal versus extremes, that broadhead we just went through with vectors is going to create massive holes, and it requires very little force. So you're going to get both.
Mm-hmm.
And actually probably better than a 3-to-1 head is my theory. I mean, based on all the media I leverage, it requires less force, and it's definitely going to cut more.
Yeah.
But yeah, two holes better than 1, especially if you have the old drain plug. I mean, that's definitely a better blood trail. But
yeah.
What I want to see is blood on both sides of the trail.
Right.
And I'm just like you, but it takes lacerations to get it, and cutting is better than pushing. That's what people have to remember. Like cutting, for example, a 1.5-inch sever. I think we tested severs. Let me pull it up, because I did a 1.5 sever and a 2.0 sever. So a 1/2 inch more blade. The difference is 150 pounds of push force through that hard material versus 135. I mean, that's not a lot considering you have a whole inch worth of blade, right? And blades that cut don't punish you as much as ferrules that don't cut.
Right. Well, and that you bring up a good point about the size of the cut, which is we've talked about a broadhead that runs through essentially a perfect scenario, right? Behind doesn't hit rib, goes through organs like the dream shot, golden triangle, whatever you want to call it. What about when shots aren't where you want them to be and they hit bone and they hit, obviously there's a difference between a scapula, outside of scapula, versus when you go closer to the shoulder and then also your knuckles. What have you found? Because what I want to do is let's start from the front of an arrow and work our way back with this conversation, if that's fair.
Real fast, let me correct something, because I just read 2 wrong numbers. The sever 1.5 was 141. The 2.0 was 156. I'm sorry, I read the wrong 2 numbers over there. Not much of a difference between that. To answer your other question, there is, if you wanted to design a broadhead that was optimal for bone, there's no doubt about it. The 2-blade is better than the 3-blade. If we're going through the flat part of the scapula, anyone that's killed enough animals know there's parts of the scapula you can get through with anything, and then there's the spine of the scapula that you're not going to get through with very many things. So you kind of have to wager your bets, and you have to say, okay, if I don't want to have to worry about that scapula at all, I would want to go after a broadhead that's a 2-blade that can take the brunt force of that heavy bone and try to get through it, right? There's no right or wrong here. There's just a choice you have to make. The percent of the animal's body that is covered with hard bone is very, very small, right? So everyone talks about the worst case scenario. The highly probable worst case scenario for me on a whitetail or a whitetail size animal is that some bitch spinning and me going up through the guts and into a lung. Mm-hmm. And if I'm going to go up through the guts and through the diaphragm and into one lung, I want a lot of lacerations. Mm-hmm. There is a chance or a lower probability that I'm going to go right into that knuckle. But the knuckle that everybody fears is this big. It's the size of a damn softball at its best. And the spine is about this long. If you hit that, there's no guarantee you're going to get through with anything. That's one thing that's interesting to me with the Ashby group is they shoot these hogs, but they always take quartering away shots. Why the hell are you taking quarter away shots with this gear? Shoot that sumbitch right in the joint. And let's see if you get through it. Quartering away shots, if that's what you're going to do, use one of these.
A 3-blade.
So, yeah, a 3-blade. So you just want to make a decision, and there's not a right or a wrong. You just have to make a choice. I base my logic on the percentage of hit or the probability of hit. Am I going to hit a knuckle? There's a small chance I'm going to hit a knuckle. Am I going to run it up through the guts and hit one lung? There's a much greater chance of that occurring, the way animals spin and the angles that we shoot from tree stands. So I put my bets toward that. That's changed over the last 2 years. I used to be a 2-blade guy. But I hunt hogs all summer long, and I aim right for the shoulders. And I put these broadheads right into the heavy bone. You would be shocked at how often I actually hit the damn thing because they spin. And I end up going through the guts, through a diaphragm, and into a heart or into a lung, right? You rarely, the Ashby folks are right. There is a worst case scenario, but the higher probability of worst case scenario for most hunters is dealing with guts, livers, and one lung.
Well, and on a 2-blade, while we're on that topic, you have a single bevel versus double bevel, and people say that a single bevel continues to twist and cut and create a bigger hole. And one thing, I mean, I shoot single bevels some, and I like a single bevel for penetration. Don't get me wrong. But it on both, I always see the holes are very similar. Like, and you have the opportunity for what I call a flap cut that can seal itself and cut down on your blood flow. Whereas a 3-blade or something with bleeders is going to make more of a triangle or some other type of cut that stays open. What's your theory on? I mean, I guess my first question was about the single bevel versus double bevel. Is there really a difference?
Yeah, the biggest difference. I don't think there's a statistical difference or a practical difference in lethality between single bevel and double bevel. I think Dr. Ashby did some great things, but what he didn't do really well for us is give us a list of order of magnitude that's relative. Like, your arrow not breaking in tune is so important that nothing else matters. Like, literally nothing else matters. The type of bevel, think about this. You're 20 yards away. Cody's going to shoot you. You got a chance. You're going to get to pick your broadhead. Right? But you get to choose between single bevel and double bevel. You're going to be like, what the hell? I don't want to choose either one. They're both going to kill me. So there's not a statistical difference there. And if there is, I'll pay $5,000 to see the proof from Ashby's data that shows a statistical difference. There's none. There's so many things that happen when you're hitting an animal. That's really not relevant. Would it add an advantage on 1 inch of heavy bone? I think it will. Absolutely. On 1 inch of heavy bone. So if you want to build your entire rig around 1 inch of heavy bone, that's probably the way to go. Having said that, you're going to have to use a premium broadhead, because the real difference between the two bevels is a double bevel is supported on both sides, so it's less likely to roll. A single bevel is not supported on both sides and is much more likely to roll. I can simulate that all day long. I can shoot animals and see that all day long. They just recently switched their mind to say if you're going to use a single bevel, you need to go to a premium head. The previous 15 to 20 years, we've been shooting junk broadheads with single bevels, and they've been rolling. But that's the biggest difference. I've shot plenty of deer, the single bevel, because I remember that's what I went after when I read it. But now my logic is I'd rather have, since I know lacerations kill, I need this head to stay as sharp as possible. So I like that double bevel head because it's a tougher edge, and that's really undeniable. And if I'm going to kind of choose my logic, I want to choose it on facts versus what ifs. But there is no doubt that a single bevel may add advantage in 1 inch of bone, but on everything else, I'll take a head that stays sharp, and it's really easy to roll some of these edges.
And so the single bevel, is it actually twisting as it goes through? Like,
I really don't. I've seen pictures where it does, but just like you, I keep looking on the wall. I've got scapulas hanging on the wall here that I've shot in animals. Not afterwards, but like I pull the scapula out, and I always get this damn star break. I never get that S break everyone talks about. I can get S patterns in meat, but I've yet to have a scapula pop like this. They always punch through. And that's not saying it's not going to happen, but most of the time I get a star break.
Okay. All right. And one last question before we move on from just broadhead talk. Let's talk about a little bit about the differences in the steel that's used or the materials. Like, everybody promotes like S7 tool steel, and you have people with titanium and stainless and all this stuff. Like, where do you see the difference being there? And it sounds like you were kind of alluding to the higher end being.
If you don't have, obviously I've probably killed somewhere between 20 and 30 animals with an iron will of different variants, right? And they're almost always sharp when you pull them out, right? When we shot this bison It was a broadhead test, shooting the bison. We ate it. Obviously, my mother got most of the meat, but we were intentionally shooting different broadheads into this bison, and it was really random. I've got one big giant scapula hanging up on the wall over here, and there's a Zwicky sticking through the T, and that Zwicky cut the top of my thumb off as I was processing it, the top meat right here on the knuckle, because it was still razor sharp. The other two Zwickies that were in that same shot were dull as hell. So it's random because there's some probability of edges folding, and on a premium steel, you're going to have less likely of that occurring than a lower cost steel. But for the most part, when I shoot a steel like this Wasp or a $10 head through an animal through hogs, the steel is rolled almost 100% of the time. That's dull.
Mm-hmm.
I've pulled this up. This is a BPA I'm holding up, 3-blade, the Woodsman Blood Groove. I've shot a hog and went through the humerus bone with it. It was still actually sharp. If you have the money, the premium steel is worth having. If you don't have the money, spit on some stones, get them sharp, and do your best. Because if it came down to it and we said, all right, Perino's going to shoot you at 20 yards, you want a dull head or a sharp head? I don't want to be shot at 20 yards. It's going to kill me no matter what.
Right.
It's going to kill me no matter what. So get the best you can. If you can't afford the best, take the blue collar approach, spit on some stones and get them sharp.
And there's a lot of guys that can't sharpen. So in a lot of heads, they claim to be ready to shoot out of the package, but really a lot of them aren't, correct? I mean, there's only one I've ever felt that really is scary sharp is like a Valkyrie. They're pretty sharp when they come out.
Valkyries are nasty. I've got them right here. Valkyries are sharp. Iron Will sharp. Day 6 is extremely sharp.
Yeah.
So your premium heads, if you don't like sharpening, what you're really paying for there is not only the good material, but they come with an edge. But I mean, a guy with a KME jig and some stones can get these heads. I mean, this head right now is as sharp as this isn't a guess. I put it on the best tester and tested the edge earlier. It's as sharp as a Day 6 coming out of the box. I had to spend 30 or 40 minutes, sharpening it on a stone, but it's a $12 head that's sharp. It's not going to stay sharp as long, but it's at least going to start that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we covered a pretty good piece on broadheads. Would you say? Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just the broadhead doesn't make or break the hunt, right?
Yeah.
The last thing I want is someone out there that's working and putting their dollars together and save, pack a lunch for 6 months so they can afford their hunting gear instead of eating out, to go piss away that money on an expensive broadhead. I'd rather piss away that money on a good coat that keeps them in the stand longer.
That's true.
I tell everyone that. Nobody wants to listen. They want to talk about broadhead. So if you've got the money and it gives you confidence, buy the fanciest shit you can.
Yeah.
If you don't have the money, buy the cheapest shit you can and put a little bit of elbow grease to that stone, get it face shaving sharp. And if you do your part, everything's going to be fine.
Nice. I think that's good. And also just don't buy what the hunting celebs tell you to buy, right?
No, it's the exact opposite, actually. I mean, if you look at what's being pushed, it's stuff that requires more force. If you look at the head and I tell everyone, if you had to push this through your thigh versus, this through your thigh, which one would go through easier? And if it has a tip that's as sharp as a Phillips screwdriver for eyeglasses, it's probably not going to go through very easy. Mm-hmm. And some of these big broadheads have really dull tips.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
And again, the litmus test, when you shoot your deer, look back. If there's hair in the air, that means you've done your part. That thing cut the hair as it went in. You want to see hair in the air floating. If you get to your animal and you're opening up and you find hair on the inside of your animal, you're pushing that hair through, and that requires a lot of force.
I've seen a lot of hair in the air before, but it's usually white hair from the belly because I was skinny.
That's I know. That's the first thing I looked at. I'm like, what kind of hair do I have floating around?
So that means I had a sharp broadhead if it just showed hair.
Your broadhead did its part. You screwed up. No one talks about that. You can't sell anything to fix that.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start. The next component part we're going to get to is like inserts, and also what everybody talks about a lot these days is being how fucked up are you? And I know you and I shared some messages about that, because I've always been, I never weighed or balanced my FOC. I couldn't tell you what it is. Like I have a guestimate, but
let's do this real fast. It'll be It'll be simple, right? FOC. Whenever we study FOC, whenever I add weight to the front of the arrow, I can't just study the effectiveness of that broadhead weighing more. It changes the total arrow weight. It changes the spine of the arrow, and it changes the node location of the arrow. So whenever we put heavier heads on and we shoot and we say, oh, we're getting better results, it must be because of that heavier head. And we'll create a metric called FOC. The reality is you're using a stiffer arrow that bends less on impact. And that's certainly, it's easier if you take a piece of rebar that's straight and I ask you to shove it through cardboard that's a half-inch thick, and then I give you a piece of bent rebar, it's going to be harder to push the bent rebar through, right? So a stiffer arrow will always penetrate better than a weaker arrow because on impact, I'm doing this one of my damn aluminums, it's better with a carbon, but on impact it bends, and that requires force. The other thing that we do when we add weight to the front of the arrow, if you find are you familiar with the node of an arrow, like how to find the node of an arrow? You find it. You just hit the arrow and you move your thumb and your pointer finger until you find the highest point of vibration, which on this arrow is here. If I add, this is 125 grain blood groove. If I add this to that, it's actually going to move that node up quite a bit. And if I put about 18% FOC on here, that node's going to move right to the back of the broadhead. And what that actually does, that node is where the arrow bends. So if you move that node up, less of your broadhead is planing left and right. And it narrows that down. And that allows your arrow to be a little bit more accurate. So people say, oh, they recover faster. It's just physics. But if you hear someone say it's just physics, that's a red flag. They don't know what the hell they're talking about. The FOC moves up, and that makes a little bit shoot a little bit more accurate. Around 18% to 20% is really good on carbon. Aluminum likes a more balanced arrow. The world record for recurve shooting was done with, I think, 15% FOC. And most of the archers shooting in that competition at 55 yards, I think was around 14 and 16% FOC. So heavy FOC is not more accurate, but it does give you a stiffer arrow, which does reduce force because it's not bending on impact as much. It does increase your total arrow weight, which gives you more momentum. And it does move that node up that makes your arrow fly a little bit better. It has nothing to do with a heavy ball with a ribbon behind it. Your head's not pulling your arrow. That's not the way the world works. That's the advantage of FOC. What I find when I get over that 18 to 20% mark, I find the arrows to become very critical and hard to tune. And if tuning is the most significant factor, which I know that to be true, I'm not going to jeopardize that. So I try to stay around 18% on carbon. On aluminums, like what I'm shooting here, I'm probably not going to go over 125 or 150. They like a more balanced arrow. Wood's the exact same.
And I would say most of our listeners are shooting carbon. And so would you say FOC?
A lot of women and kids listening to you?
No, I don't think so.
I'm joking.
But FOC versus arrow weight, which one matters more? Would you say a heavier arrow works better than FOC, or is
it's impossible for me to say because how am I going to test one without the other? Like when I increase FOC, my arrow weight's going to go up. I've never ran that test. I could always use a lighter arrow, I guess, and then get my FOC up for total arrow weight, but then I end up with an arrow that breaks a little bit more. So I tend to focus more on a balanced build and around that 18% mark. I've never seen a really good repeatable shootable tune above 20%.
Nice. I mean, I would say that's about where I'm at. 20. I just went down in my arrow weight this year on my bows, because one thing I look for, being predominantly a white soil hunter hunting thick cover, is I want flat trajectory so I can shoot through holes. Whereas when I shoot heavier arrows, I have more of, the arc, and I don't like an arc when I'm in thick timber and shooting through, like early season right now with a lot of brush. I may have to put something through a baseball. Well, I won't try to shoot through a baseball hole, but let's say a basketball size hole.
Yeah.
I would much rather have something that's shooting straight and flat, which how I have my bows tuned right now, I don't have much arc between 10 to 25 yards. It shoots pretty flat. And when I went down in weight and I kept my FOC, what I'm shooting is a 400 grain I mean, a 400 spine HMR from Vector, which I think is around 8.9 per inch, somewhere in that range. And I'm shooting on my 56-pound bow. I have a 200 grain head in their outsert system, which is 53 grains, and it shoots faster and flatter. But I'm also just in my redneck home test, it's hitting better, getting better penetration into my target than I was shooting a heavier arrow last year. I was shooting the what are they? The geez, I can't remember. Shit. I just had a brain fart. That happens all the time. But anyway, it was like 11 grains per inch arrow, and I was shooting 285 up front on that, and I was getting less penetration in my target, but also in my, it was shooting slower as well.
Right. There's a point where you lose energy, and really, momentum is a function of speed and mass, not just mass. And sometimes people forget that. But I killed a lot of pigs this year with the hammer at arrow. I find that to be a really good weight. I like that low modulus design. It tunes a little bit more like an aluminum for me than a carbon. Mm-hmm. And what I typically try to encourage people to do, the longer your broadhead, the more likely it is you're going to have a failure, because it creates a lever arm on the threads, right? So I really like these 125 grain heads, 150 grain heads, and I put my weight in the inserts or the outserts, whatever it is. So like if I'm running an iron wheel, I might have a 100 grain insert with a 20 grain collar over there with a 125 over it, or a 50 grain insert most of the time with a 20 grain collar and a 125 head. I shot the bear the spring with a hammer arrow, 150 grain iron wheel wide. I had a 50 grain insert and his collar. And that's given me around 17, 18% FOC. My arrow was, I think, 515 grains, zipped right through the bear, went right through him and stuck in a log behind him. I'm like you. I like shooting on the flats. If I need to know the difference between 21 and 23 yards, I'm hosed, because I can't judge yardage quickly like that. So if like I'm mule deer hunting, you'll see me shooting a flatter arrow. Now, if I'm shooting a Howard Hill bow, like I was talking to you about before, which I love, and I'm going to shoot some wood arrows out of it, and I'm going to stay in really close, hell, let's get a heavy arrow. I don't give a damn, right? I'm not going to shoot further than 15 yards. Heavy arrows are actually better because it minimizes my gap. But if you're trying to play in that 20 to 25 yard range, especially in trad, you need to try to build a flat there. And it's usually a little bit more modest arrow. But I like shorter broadheads, and I put the weight in my components if I need weight. Long heads create lever arms that create failure points. So I like these short heads. I shot a couple of pigs. I think I've got 3 or 4 with the outsert that they have. And I broke one arrow, and everything else is held together.
And I've always felt through my own redneck studies is like when you start putting those components inside the insert, it stiffens up the front of that arrow, which we don't have as much of a problem with what I call tail whip on a trad bow because of velocity. But when I shot compound, I'll share, I shot a big buck in Ohio with this was when I was young and dumb. Sorry if you're a mechanical guy, but I shot a big buck and hit him in the shoulder with a rage in the cage. And when it hit, it broke a FMJ right at the ferrule. And I was just using a standard small brass insert with that head. And from that point on, I started going to like the Black Eagles where I could add the weight to the back. And I felt like extending that internal system through the arrow, stiffen that front up to keep that from happening. Is there any truth to that, or am I just...
No, there's absolute truth to that. I had an ethics system I was trying to tune this year, and it spiked it made the arrow a lot stiffer than it should be. So you remember that node I was speaking about?
Yes.
If you move that node up in the arrow and then you shove something down on that node, my theory is that spikes the stiffness of the arrow because it doesn't allow it to bend like it should. So I always try to stick with systems that are a little bit, I don't want to get this far into the arrow. I want to stay, reasonably short and keep it out of that node. That's a theory. That's not a fact. That's my theory. But I have seen for sure where I've shoved really long inserts in, and it does really weird things to the spine. I'm assuming it's disrupting that node that needs to be there.
That makes.
I'm playing with 7 carbon. Go ahead.
And you also, I would think if you get that tail whip, you're losing penetration, which we'll talk about arrow in a minute. And tune,
massive.
when it tail whips, it's slowing that arrow down. Whereas if it's stiffer up front, it's going to push right through, like the rebar we talked about.
Yeah, but it's a greater effect than that, because you're talking about angle of entry, right? So if your arrow is not perfectly perpendicular to your target, if you don't have those nodes aligned, you're losing a ton of energy. It's like anything. I mean, being hit direct or being hit offset. Like if you're trying to, it takes a ton of energy away when you offset that energy. So having the arrow perfectly in line, or having those nodes aligned when it impacts, is the biggest factor associated with penetration.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
I mean, short of your arrow breaking. Yet people are shooting untuned arrows and then trying to buy broadheads that'll work well. There's not a broadhead in the world that will help you if you don't have a tuned arrow. Just tune your arrow, get it shooting straight, and you'll zip through some of these animals. I'm intentionally bringing my weight down. I'm going antelope hunting with 41 pounds with aluminum arrows that weigh 550. I don't like doing that. I'm doing that to lower all the factors so people can see with a perfect tune what you're capable of. I mean, shooting a gigantic black bear with 48 pounds wasn't my top choice, but I knew I could do it if my arrow was tuned, and it zipped right through using a relatively low weight arrow and a razor sharp head. I think people really miss the boat when they try to choose a broadhead that's going to take care of penetration. I have a saying, I say the back of the arrow is more important than the front of the arrow. I'm referring to that tune and the recovery.
Yeah.
And people really need to get their stuff tuned and just get a sharp broadhead and they'll be fine.
Because a broadhead can't do what it's supposed to do if it doesn't hit center.
Not if the back is offset, it would be like you trying to throw a cross with a crooked arm. You're not going to get any juice on it. You have to rotate your shoulders so they're in line with the cross to get any kind of pop on it. If you try to throw a cross like a beginner where your body's at a 45-degree angle, you're not going to have anything on it versus rotating. And if your arrow's not aligned, all that mass goes off to the left or to the right, not straight.
Or if it's flying towards a target and hits sideways with the arrow, broadhead going in, you're just cutting with essentially on a 3-blade, one flange instead of letting the tip do its work and expand into the head.
Yeah, then you got all kinds of problems. Yeah. So it's really about getting that arrow tuned. If there is no reason why a compounder isn't killing everything in North America with 50 pounds. I mean, there's no reason. Not if I can do it with these lightweight recurves.
Right.
Marie Sturgis is killing animals with a 35-pound recurve. I mean, she's gone to Africa and taken big animals with it. So, I mean, it's a perfect tune and it's a razor sharp head.
Do you see much variance while we're talking about arrows between carbon, aluminum, and wood? Or does it?
In spine, aluminums are very, 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 very tight tolerance. There are some brands of carbon arrows where you'll see a lot of spine variation from arrow to arrow, but aluminum's really tight. And actually wood sorts to people buy wood in 5-pound increments of spine. So wood can actually be tighter tolerance than carbon in terms of spine. And I do think spine is more important than straightness. With carbon, though, all the tolerances seem to correlate together. Like if you get a straight arrow, typically you're going to get a relatively consistent spine in that patch. And
you always hear the debates on especially, we're both trad guys and probably follow more trad forums. And there's always this ongoing debate between guys that move towards the stiffer spine versus, like a 350 to 400 versus a 500. You can usually, a lot of times you can get bows attuned with a lot of different ones across the spectrum a little bit, depending on how you cut your arrow and how you match your broadheads and everything up, right? But you're going to have some difference in the flexibility between those spines. So you're saying if you can lean more towards the stiffer spine, that you're going to have better penetration. Is that?
Yeah. I don't do anything extreme. I try to get my bow set right in the middle of its window of tune. But if I have a choice, I'd rather shoot a 350 than a 400. And usually I do that in length. I shoot really long arrows. My arrows are usually full length if I can get them that way. It minimizes my gap and it allows me to shoot a stiffer arrow.
Yeah, I found for me what I like I draw a 29 and I like a 30.5-inch arrow. It seems that's the best for me for my style of shooting, which there's just, I'm not very educated in the trad world, but in my opinion, instinct comes from gap. You can't just pick up any bow and say I'm an instinct shooter and I grab your bow and all of a sudden I start 10 ringing, right? You have to learn gap before you can learn instinct.
That's my theory, but Chris and I, we argue, but it's in good jest. But I think some people think gap is like hard aiming. Really, especially in a hunting situation, that bracket or that space is just in your mind's eye, and I can quickly reference it and get the shot off it. And I don't stick with the same bow long enough, but if you were to stick with the same bow and arrow long enough, that eventually becomes gap stinctive.
Right.
And you'll be able to index your bow and shoot really, really fast and accurately if you stick with the same setup. I have to test a lot of bows and a lot of arrows. So I usually have a piece of painter's tape on my limb telling me what my gap is. But I have to look down and go, okay, this one's 15 inches. This one's 20 inches.
Yeah.
Because I don't have that in. When I retire from TradLab, I'll go to one bow and I can do that.
Yeah. And you start learning that after you start shooting that bow a little bit, it becomes instinctive. I mean, it's like throwing a baseball or football, right? I mean, they're essentially instinctive throwing, but you can't throw that football the same way you do the baseball with the force to hit the same spot. Like you have to learn the difference in weight is how I've always looked at it. But, if I shoot my bow enough, it's all instinct, right? I know exactly where it's going just by looking, and I can just focus on the hair that I want to hit. That's how
I would prefer to be. But again, I test so much stuff, I never get to burn it in.
Yeah. Now moving back, let's talk about fletchings a little bit.
Okay.
So the standard has always been three fletching. It doesn't matter if you're compound or a trad guy, like that's what everything comes with, is with 3 fletchings, and they vary in size. Most trad guys are 3 5-inch, which I've shot a bunch of them, and you play with those a lot. What have you noticed the difference but with the fletchings?
So your fletching choice, what I try to encourage people is to not listen to my studies. Your fletching choice should be based on your own form. So a new guy coming into trad, forget about TradLab studies, put 5-inch feathers on there and go figure out how to shoot and have fun and get through some animals, right? I shoot 2-inch fletching. That's what I'm fletching up arrows as we speak here. You see me rotate a few out. Mm-hmm. I'm using this, you can see that orange knob on the bits. Mm-hmm. That's an AAE bits knob. So I'm actually, because these are larger diameter arrows, I'm putting 5 2-inch fletchings on here, and I'm going to go antelope hunt with those. But if you're new, put 5-inch on there and forget about everything we're about to talk about, because it's the big 5-inch feathers are going to cover up any kind of form errors you have. As you develop your form, which you have to do first, then you can develop your tune. Those feathers are a liability. They're an asset in flight, and they're an absolute liability the moment you hit the animal, right? Because they're just sucking up energy, and they also make a lot of noise hissing through the air. The longer feathers create more problems than the shorter feathers in terms of sound and performance and crosswinds. This isn't a theory. This is something I have spent thousands of hours studying. I can show the math and the study, and it's pretty rock solid. In a crosswind, a 5-inch equipped arrow is going to be offset more so than one with less feather. So what I encourage people to do is use as little feather as you can to stabilize your arrow. I'm a firm believer in strong helical, and you get most of your stability from a high feather, not a long feather. Mm-hmm. So I use a 2-inch feather that's a shield cut, which is very high. Mm-hmm. Pulling out here, you may have seen me fletch a few up.
That's what I use, a shield cut.
Yeah, it's a relatively high feather. I can go get one if you need here. Actually, these are hammers with broadheads on them. So I almost cut. These are my bear arrows. I almost cut my damn finger. Actually, that is the bear arrow that went through the bear. These are matted down because it went through an animal, but that's what I hunt with on almost every configuration. It's a 4 fletch, 2-inch, and you can see on this this hammer that they're actually kind of crowded. It can't go with a 5 fletch. The aluminum arrows are larger diameter and allowing me to go with a 5 fletch configuration at 2-inch, and you get less noise and you get less effective crosswind, and your arrows are higher, which people worry about. But again, if that node of that arrow is forward, the further away your feather is from that node, the further away it is from your riser when you shoot. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So if your node is way up here, most of your contact issues come from the first third of big feathers. And when I realized that, I'm like, well, I'm going to go to shorter feathers and just use one more of them. and I had a lot less clearance issues, and I had really good stability and really low sound. When I used my decibel meter and I set it up, this was in Michigan. So Michigan mornings, no snow on the ground. I set a decibel meter up next to a whitetail 3D target, and I had a camera up, and I was measuring the sound of the arrow when the decibel meter could detect the sound of the arrow and how far away it was from the target. And a 5-inch 3-fletch out of a tuned arrow could rise above the ambient sound at around 12 yards from the target. It could be detected. And I got that down to around 7 to 9 yards using perfectly tuned arrows with 2-inch 4-fletch.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also realized that there's benefits in terms of crosswinds and how they handle it. So I prefer shorter fletch, but I also wet sand my tune. I have a really good tune. I have relatively decent form. On slower bows or heavier arrows, I had to go to a 3-fletch. What I'm hoping happens now is I can use this 5-fletch configuration with this knob and add a 5th 2-inch there instead of 3-inch, because it still doesn't make as much noise. So that was a lot of talking, but ultimately, the better you are with your form and your tune, the less fletching you need, and you need to use as little as you can to stabilize your broadhead. And the final step I always take is broadhead tuning. And if I can put broadhead and fill points on top of one another, I'm going to use as little amount of feather as I can. And don't be afraid of high feathers. As long as they're short, you're not going to have contact issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, because one gentleman asked, why do you want to use 25 2-inch baby feathers when 3 5-inches work for years?
Mr. Perino is never wrong. I love that.
Yeah,
well, Perino's killing most of his animals. I always tease him that he's killing them with tetanus and not lacerations.
Yeah,
and
he also shoots them like 5 yards.
Yeah, if you look at his mature does, they have whip marks all over the side of them when arrows hit sideways.
Yeah,
no, he's not wrong. The man can kill, and you don't need to do all of this. Like I said, put 5-inch on there and go hunt. Yeah. But if you want to wet sand your tune, that has proven to be optimal.
Well, and we are, I look at, like, I'm a relatively new trad guy, like I said, 4 or 5 years in, I think 4 years. All right. I shouldn't say 4 or 5. I'm 4 years in. And when I started, I had shitty form, but I've shot every day, most days, to improve my form. And when I started, there's no way I could have shot. I couldn't bare shaft tune a bow. Like, that's one thing, a misconception people get that come from compound is your form is more important than your bow. The bow is going to do what it's supposed to do, but your form is what's driving the arrow with a trad bow. So there's no way, because a lot of guys will hit me up and be like, "Hey, how do I bare shaft tune? I just started shooting trad." I'm like, "Well, you're not going to be able to because your form sucks." I mean, I hate to say it, but you're not, unless you genetically you're just natural at shooting trad, which maybe there are some people that are. Your form is not going to be good enough to get that perfect tune. So 5 inches of feather are going to steer more. It's the same thing with an airplane. Bigger wings steer the jet, right? But as
absolutely going to steer more.
But as my form has gotten better, I'm able to bare shaft tune now. And I have shot 4-inch, but this year I started shooting 4 3-inch feathers. And even my business partner Jordan, who's a compound and a trad guy, we were shooting them because I always have, when I bare shaft tune, I have somebody video me from behind so I can really see in slow-mo what it's doing, more so than paper tuning or anything like that. I can see what the arrow is actually doing, and also with feathers on. But we noticed, I bare shaft tuned the arrow before I put feathers on because it was shooting pretty straight with my form. I'm not perfect form, but I call it good enough. And we noticed a significant difference in sound, like you're talking about, between 4 3s versus my 3 5s. Right. I mean, you couldn't even hear it. And it was shooting faster, but it's just simple math. 3 times 5 is 15. 4 times 3 is 12.
Right. That's the way it works. Yeah.
So there's less material.
There's less material there. So, I mean, I tell everyone to ignore those studies. If you're new to the archer has more to do with the success of a hunt, especially in trad. Nothing can. So if you're new and you don't have your form, put the big 5.5 inch feathers on there and go get after it. As you start building that up, the less feather you have on the back of that arrow, the quieter that arrow is going to be. and the better it's going to handle crosswind. But you have to start with a tuned bow, and in order to tune a bow, you have to have good form. But that's the spiel. Start with 5 and work your way down. Experiment with it. Don't go to the field for the first time with a broadhead and 2-inch fletching, because you don't want to do that. You want to do some broadhead tuning and see what you can get away with. But the less feather you have, the better sound quality you're going to have. And if you don't have speed, you need to have sound on your side.
Yeah, and then also for penetration factor, smaller profile feathers are absorbing less material when they go through.
Yeah, feathers lay down pretty good. What I encourage everybody to do is either silk wrap the front of the arrow like the old timers did, or at least put a dab of glue or cement on the front of that quill and then sand it down. If you're seeing hair, if you're seeing hair caught on that quill, that's robbing you of force. You want to make sure it's not catching anything.
I never thought about that. I've always thought about the whole, if you didn't glue the front of the feather, you have that little resistance, but I didn't think about sanding that, because I always put a dab there, but I don't sand it down. Okay.
Yeah, just put a dab there and then taper it down. Or if you want to go the extra mile, I'll wrap silk. I'll do a whip knot around there and I wrap the silk up over the front of the quill. And then I take glue on my finger and pull it around that silk to smooth it out, to make it a nice, even, smooth transition.
Oh, sweet.
That's what the old timers did. That's not anything new. That's old school shit. It works really well.
No, they were using sinew though.
Right. I mean, silk's been used a long time for that, and it works really well. They slide right through.
And so like parabolic versus shield cut, like, I mean, for me, I use shield cut because I work off of 3 anchor points for how I shoot. I shoot 2 fingers under. I don't shoot 3. I shoot 2 under, because I feel like my break is more controllable with 2 fingers rather than 3. And I do middle finger, corner of my mouth, and a shield cut touches my nose perfect every time when I have it set, the jig set right, because I know where to set my jig for my feather to where that happens when I'm in perfect alignment. And then I put my thumb knuckle behind my jaw. That's my 3rd anchor point that I feel. And that's just me with my own. I didn't learn that anywhere. It just kind of come up, and I felt like 3 points is better. Is there a difference between the shield and parabolic when it comes to flight and also penetration?
Penetration, no, as long as you take care of that front quill. Flight, yes. Higher feathers, more stable. A feather's height has a bigger impact than its length in terms of stability, but stability and sound correlate perfectly together. I would love to shoot parabolic because I like the sound of it. It sounds a lot less. It makes a lot less noise as it's going through the air, but I'm not good enough. It doesn't. I'm hoping the 5-fletch may allow me to go to maybe a parabolic, because it doesn't make as much noise. But these little 2-inch shields, they stabilize a lot better, and I can shoot broadheads and get away with. You don't have perfect form when you're hunting, right? So you need something that kind of saves your ass when you pluck one, or when something goes wrong, or when you've had to hold for 30 or 40 seconds. And the shield cut stabilizes better. It just sounds worse, but that's everything in life's a trade-off, and that's the trade-off. I'd rather be stable and a little loud than quiet and crooked.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
Penetration, as long as the quill's down, you're going to be fine.
Gotcha. So moving past the feathers into a knock, I mean, is there much study you've done with knocks? Like, I've noticed a difference between lighted knocks versus traditional knocks. Just my own personal opinion.
Maybe you can reach the. I'm begging people to make a good lighted knock that's consistent, because I love lighted knocks, especially for seeing the arrow fly. I love lighted knocks, but it's really hard to get good tunes with them because they're so damn inconsistent. I don't know anything about compounds, so I can't speak to that, but I know on a recurve, knock fit on the string is very, very important. I really like, and I almost exclusively use now, an IP knock. And you can see it's got a bally here to account for your string angle, and it also has the secure clip, so it always clips on. And if you take an instrument, measure the force required to unclip knocks off your serving, you'd be shocked if you had a dozen of the exact same knocks of the exact same package, how different they all are. So I try to, if you're a traditional archer, you need to take a blue collar approach to your hobby, and you have to learn how to do some things. You're going to have to learn how to serve your strings so you can match that serving size to whatever your knock of choice is. I really like, this is 0.21 serving on most of my strings to fit this perfectly. I like a good solid knock, but I can flip it with my finger and pop it off my string if I need to.
Mm-hmm.
But it needs to, your string travels in a figure 8 motion when it gets to the end, and you need a consistent release so your knock's coming off your string when it's straight.
Mm-hmm.
The IP knock gives me that. Everyone has their preferences. The most common are biter, G knocks, and then I really like, this is the best of both worlds. It's an IP. I've tried to go to lighted knocks, but the damn things just aren't consistent enough for me yet.
Yeah, I mean, I have a horror story from lighted knocks when I shot compound. The biggest deer I've ever went to draw on. I've been hunting all year, and it was a loose fitting lighted knock. And when I went to put my release on the D loop, it touched the arrow and shot my arrow off the rest.
Oh yeah, they're terrible. Or they'll go off at full draw. I mean, they're just, and they don't have consistent bid. But yeah, a good knock is really important, especially for trad. I know nothing about compound, but I'll replace my knocks every now and then because they do wear and your serving wears. So I'll reserve the string. I'll replace the knocks to make sure I have good, nice fit, and because it'll completely change your tune.
Because you want a little movement, but not too much, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I want to be able to. I don't have one strung up. You want to be able to tip your bow upside down and clip your arrow on. Grab the string with your fingers and rotate it, and it not swing your arrow left and right. You want it to be able to rotate through there, but you want your arrow to be able to hang on.
Gotcha.
And if you tap that with your finger, you want it to be able to pop off. Because as your string's traveling, you don't want it pushing your arrow while it's still not let go of the string. And consistent knock, when you're really, really fine tuning, and you find you can't get a good tune, oftentimes it's really sloppy knock bit.
Gotcha. That's good to know. That's something. And so I would assume you're shooting 2 knocks.
Yeah, I tie my knocks in.
Yeah, 2 tied knocks.
Yeah, 2 tied knocks, and I secure them in pretty good. And I use adjustable knocks so I can move them up and down to get the exact height I need, and then I just lock them in. And
how tight do you like your knocks on your knots on your knock itself?
I mean, I don't want to move it around. I guess it's a constrictor knot, but I'll do 10 wraps on there, and I cinch it down pretty tight. And then I'll move it to get it tuned, and once I get it where I want, I'll put glue on there to seal it in. But I don't want to move it around.
And you want it both of them pretty tight on your knock itself?
The arrow? You mean the knock itself? No, I'm sorry. I thought you meant on the string. On the knock itself, I'll draw back and look at it. And if it's affecting the knock in any way, I want a little bit of a gap there. It's probably a 16th to maybe an 1/8. But at full draw, you don't want those knocks pushing into those knock ties pushing into your knock. You want enough room for it to be level, if you will. And I thought you were talking about the tightness on the string. And I do like to use fluorescent colors. You wouldn't believe how nice it is to be able to see. If you're ever having to do a quick knock, it's nice to be able to see where your knock set is.
Yeah, I use white.
Yep.
Light, fluorescent or white. Yeah, that, especially if you're not want to turn your headlamp on in the morning and things like that. I mean, and I don't know. While we're talking about the back of the arrow, cock feather out versus, does that really matter?
No, not at all. Not at all. Left or right, like the way your arrow naturally rotates out of the bow, I can't shoot the difference. I've studied it with recurves, but I do it because it drives me nuts. So I'll figure out which way it rotates, and I'll match the wing to that. But you don't have to do that. And cock feather up, down, as long as you're not getting inner contact, you're fine. A bigger mistake, to be honest with you, I see people make is they'll have different angles of helical from arrow to arrow, where like their bits moves or they make an adjustment. And if you have different helical from arrow to arrow, you're going to have different vertical stringing. So lock the damn bits in, get it right, and go from there.
So, and always when we're talking about like putting another arrow on, you don't have to worry about the cock feather when you have 4 feathers on there.
No, you just throw it on there and go.
Yeah.
And I'm like you. I touch a feather to my nose, so I like a consistent alignment. But it's because my feathers are short, I really never have to worry about contact. If I'm worrying about contact, my arrow's way out of tune.
Right.
Because my arrow's 3/4 of an inch from the bow by the time the feathers get there.
Okay. What? So to sum that up, a guy had asked, what is your go-to whitetail arrow broadhead setup for your bow?
mine personally. I mean, do you want me to consider budget options or just mine personally?
Yours personally. Like if no budget was considered, what are you leaving the house with to go whitetail hunting and having a lot of confidence in that you're like, this is the best thing that through my data and experience, this is what I find for shooting whitetails?
Through I don't have enough data to say one will be, I don't have enough back-based data to say that. I don't think anybody on this planet does, but I'll give you my opinion on what works, and I'll give you my logic. But I don't have enough data to tell me one arrow from another. Mm-hmm. The vector hammer is my preference right now with Snyder Core iron wheels, and the logic behind that. The vector arrow tends to be a little bit more linear to respond because I believe it's because of the low modulus when I tune. Mm-hmm. I like it. I like micro diameters when I'm shooting my ILF. And the Snyder Core has that stem on it. It's what's on that bear arrow that goes down the center of that arrow, and it spins perfectly every time. It's a perfect spin every time. You put a collar over that, you have a bulletproof arrow. An iron wheel wide creates massive lacerations. It's a deadly arrow that requires very little force. I've run it through that. I think that bear was 325-pound bear, plenty big, lots of hair, big shoulder mass. It went through with no problems and stuck to the other side. I've killed several pigs with that same configuration. It does really well. Not everybody can afford super expensive broadheads. So outside of that, if you're willing to put a good edge on a solid broadhead, like this blood groove, it requires very little force for a 3-blade solid. And if you're willing to put a good edge on there, it'll do just fine. And if you want to go even cheaper, the hammers are good as well.
What's the difference? You keep pulling up the blood groove. What is the difference between the blood groove, the traditional VPA, and the tough head 3-blade? Because they're all made by VPA, correct?
Yeah. I don't know how well you can see here. Do you see those recesses there?
Yeah, I do.
Right there. This weighs 125 grains. Mm-hmm. And they've moved to a pyramid tip here. Mm-hmm. If you can see that, there you go.
Yeah.
That pyramid tip doesn't bend. And as long as I can get this sharp, this thing, if you see the very back, it doesn't develop a ferrule until the very back. Otherwise, that's all blade. Mm-hmm. See how that's all blade? Mm-hmm. That's very little force to go through an animal. Because there's everything that's touching the animal is cutting the animal.
Gotcha.
And that's why I like the blood groove. They've gotten rid of that ferrule to reduce weight. But in a sense, what they've also done is gotten rid of the force requirements. And it's not 3-to-1. If you look at that, that's about, actually it's the exact same length as the hammer. There's something very magical about 2-to-1. And I like those. I like shorter heads with components on the back. So that's my preference. I'm only picking it up because that's what I got here.
So the only difference between that and the tough head 3-blade is the tough head is more of a 3-to-1 than a 2-to-1, correct?
I don't have a tough head, but I'm assuming it's got more ferrule on it. Yeah, and I don't know what the tip is.
I have one. It's similar to that. It has those same grooves in it, like you're showing, but it's a longer head than that one because I have those too in 125s. Okay. I was just curious. I didn't know. I haven't really compared them.
Yep. If you take that, you've seen that 344 sharpener with a 34 degree angle. Mm-hmm. If you take that and get these razor sharp, they are deadly as hell. And they do really, I mean, I went through a humorous bone on a running pig about 2 months ago. Mm-hmm. I was really impressed with this little bastard. And it didn't roll the tip. It didn't go knock high when it hit the bone. It went right through and stopped in the opposite shoulder. And on a running shoulder assembly, that's really hard for a head to do. So I'm really impressed with it. And I like the 125 weight because if you're traveling and you forget your broadheads, you can run to Walmart and get 125 grain head in a jam.
That's true. Yeah. I never even thought about it that way.
There's some value in redundancy when you're a shitty planner like myself.
Yeah. And you probably, with a 3-blade, you have less chance to roll your tip than you do with a 2-blade, right?
That's exactly right. Especially now that they've got this pyramid tip. The old Woodsmans kind of had a fine point tip and they were made up a little bit cheaper, but the Woodsman Elites, they're put together very well. And this just happens to be their 125 version that has very little ferrule on it. So it just zips right through. Out of that test I just did, this would have taken 4th place. And so that's right behind premium blade heads and a 2-blade.
When they go up to 125, that's right.
The blood groove is 125. That's And I like I said, there's just a little bit of, if you put the weight in your system versus your head, you can go to Walmart on a, let's say you lose your arrows. Shit happens when you travel, or you forget to pack your broadheads or whatever. You run to Walmart, you can find a 125 grade head in a pinch and get it done.
And you just compensate that with, if you want heavier weight up front, you just compensate that with the weight in the back.
Yep. Put it in your insert in your collar. That's what I do.
Nice. I think we've touched everything on arrows and broadheads. Wouldn't you say? Is there anything we've missed?
I think you covered it in detail. This is like a job interview. Yeah. Those are a lot of tough questions.
I mean, it's just, I'm kind of a nerd myself, so I like to dive in a little bit. So now we're going to move to some rapid fire questions. That's how I like to end things. One is, you do a lot of whitetail hunting, right?
Yep.
What's your favorite tree snack when you're in the tree? Snack.
Mine or the deer's? Mine?
Yes, I know.
Oh, it's embarrassing. Fig Newtons.
Oh, Fig Newton's a really good one.
Yeah. Really? I thought that would be, yeah. No, I know nobody eats Fig Newtons, but I'm an old school nerd and I love Fig Newtons.
I know. When after you eat the cookies, and if you're looking for something in a survival situation, there's always crumbs in the bag.
That's right. Yeah. I really like them.
I had one other one, but I think you already answered that. You're not fucked, right?
Again, 18 to 20% is what I'll run on a carbon arrow. And that's just because that's what my findings show to be optimal.
What do you prefer, private or public land?
When I lived in Michigan, I would have loved to have had private land because it was just so crowded. I live in Kansas now, and quite frankly, some of the public land is, although it's really getting pounded hard now, is pretty good. But obviously, if I had my preference, I'd love to have access to a lot of private, but I don't. I have one private place to hunt, and I usually fending off poachers off of it. So I'll hit a lot of walk-in as well.
Nice. Same. I mean, I hunt a lot of public because I have a lot of it here. And what I always say is the money I would put in buying land or paying for a lease, I could use that money for more tags on public. So I get to have more hunting experiences.
Yeah. I'm not one of those guys. If someone kills a buck on a nice lease, I don't look down on them for having a lease.
No,
it's so damn ridiculous that unless you're hunting on public land with a stick bow and that you made yourself with arrow, people don't want to kind of diminish a kill. As a hunter, if someone's pursuing fair game legally, I don't give a damn if they're paying a guide, if they're on a lease, if they're on public land. More power to them. If I had enough money, you'd never see my ass on public land. I guarantee you. So more power to him. Chris Perino, we've referred to him a lot. He's taught me a ton. And one of the most recent arguments that he won, he said, Cody, you piss away all this money on gear. Go buy a landowner tag and go after some monster animals. And he's absolutely right. The money I piss away on all this gear, I could buy really good landowner tags and go hunt some nice animals. And the same thing with the broadhead. Don't spend your money on an expensive broadhead. Go buy a damn coat so you can hunt when it's cold and rainy.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just looking at your bows in the background. I know how much trad bows cost. And I'm like, oh yeah, there's a couple tags.
Oh
right
there. Something happens to me. Someone needs to race to this house and make an offer to my wife because she'll get rid of it. She calls them pretty sticks. There'll be a barrel of pretty sticks out in the driveway for $5 a piece.
Yeah. Last one. Who is your hunting role model?
I have about 3 or 4 folks that I don't know if they're role models, but I trust them, subject matter experts.
And you look up to?
That I trust. And if I need advice, it's obviously Perino. It's, Snyder's helped me a lot. He answers a lot of questions. Blake Hunter, when it comes to whitetail, is someone I refer to quite a bit. I think the biggest, this is a great question because the most important skill you can have as a person trying to learn how to hunt is figure out who knows what they're talking about. Right. And like Scotty from top of Texas, I trust him. You got to wade through all these people that are talking, and you've got to find the people that know what they're talking about. And that's a lot to do with my profession for the railroad is the exact same thing. And what I tell people is I have to walk through a shop and find the one machinist that actually knows what the hell's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And that machinist is usually one that doesn't want to talk to my stupid ass.
Yeah.
Because they see me coming, right? But that's the person that knows their business well enough. That's the 10%er that knows what's going on. And if I can just ask them questions, I can go get the study done to tell their story. So the best skill someone needs to make is have a good bullshit meter. And Chris Perino, Scotty, Aaron Snyder, they're not going to argue with you. They're going to give you your opinion online. And then the people that argue with you online usually don't know what they're talking about. So choose wisely who you listen to.
Yeah.
Perino, Scotty, Snyder, Blake Hunter are all people I refer to and listen to. And I don't argue with them a whole lot. And if I don't know, I'll take their side over mine.
Yeah. I don't know who Blake Hunter is, but I know Perino very well. I've talked to Scotty a few times. I think he's a stand-up, no bullshit type of guy.
Zero bullshit.
I met Snyder in person a few years ago. Nice guy to me. And I know he's done his work in the field. Like, it speaks for itself. You don't take wisdom from people that have killed a lot of animals. And all three of those guys have either killed animals or have seen a lot more been killed. And I think that's really good. There's a lot of people out there that are putting a lot of information out that haven't really killed shit, and they're all of a sudden industry go-to people.
You gotta listen to the right people, and usually the right people don't have the most interesting things to say. They're not going to dazzle you with bullshit. And
they're not talking much.
No, they're not talking much, and it's a damn shame, because we're reading books about people that were alive 50 years ago, and we got hunters that are probably better than they are that we're ignoring. So, I mean, if people learn to listen to the right people, they're going to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
But
that's it. I hate to admit that, but that's it.
No, that's the truth. It's pretty simple common sense, in my opinion. I know you're leaving tomorrow for an antelope hunt, but what else you got on the books this year as far as hunts this fall?
I've got a lot of whitetail to hunt in Oklahoma, Missouri, and Kansas. Got a lot. We've had a drought here, so it's a different year. I got to figure that out. The acorns are going to be really, really hard to come by and essential. So I'm going to be sitting on a lot of white oaks here soon. Got antelope right now. I've got Scotty for mule deer. I've got mule deer in South Dakota, and that's about it. And then we pulled all the hog feeders and stuff down until deer season's over. As soon as deer season's over, I'll be right back to. I'm at a point now where I'm hunting year round. I'll be right back to hogs in January.
Nice. Yeah. I've only been hog hunting once. I went on the PBS hunt in Georgia and killed my first hog, which is really fun. I'd love to, we have some here in the mountains, but not a ton, but I'm not too far from Georgia, and I missed that hunt this year, but I'd love to get into shooting more pigs because they're damn good to eat and they're fun to stalk up on and shoot.
They are. It is an addiction that I didn't think I'd fall in love with it. I did it first just mainly for experience and to get my reps. Mm-hmm. But the spotting and stalking of hogs, especially mature hogs, they're tough and they're fun. But yeah, I got a full year ahead of me, and then we'll see what next year brings. But I need to start planning for that. I'm slowly escalating my way up to harder and more difficult hunts.
Yeah. We were talking about Scotty. I talked to him because Perino and do you know Scott Einsman by chance?
Yes, I do.
Scott went and hunted with Scotty last year and knows how much I like hard mountain hunts. And he's like, you have to go do an all-dad hunt. So that's what I've been talking to Scotty about. And I'm going to try to make that hunt sometime in February. I told only way I would go is if Chris guides me while I'm there.
I'm going to be there in January. You should try to. I don't think there's a lot of people in camp. I'm trying to get Chris to go. You should try to come up then.
Oh yeah, we can look at that because he was going to squeeze me in, and because February is kind of full for him, but he was going to squeeze me in. I'm just going up there to try to shoot a nanny. I just want to get a bunch of stalks in, which I've heard you can get as many as you want or physically can handle until you kill something is kind of what I've heard.
Yeah, and Scotty's. I don't know if I guess you know Scotty, but he is. I hunted with Scotty, and some people you hunt with, and it changes your perspective on life and hunting. Scotty's one of those guys.
Yeah,
he'll level set your ass really quick. You're going to learn a lot, and he's a stand-up guy. Really, really, really good people. I'll be a customer of his for life.
Yeah, it seemed that way because we were talking about earlier, like that bullshit meter you can get from people when you first talk to him, and I only talked to Scotty on the phone a couple times, and immediately talking to him, my bullshit meter was not going off.
No,
it seemed like he was, just true to the earth guy,
Yep. It's a pleasure. That place is a special place. You'll have, if you try to come up there, Denny Sturgis going to be up there the week before me. And I think he's going to stay for my week. And I'm trying to get Chris there. So that'd be cool.
Yeah. I'll talk to Chris and see, because January, I don't really have anything going on that I know of yet. I was looking at February.
Come up there. You can watch me teach Chris a few things.
I know. One thing Chris and I are going to work on is sharing a sleeping bag. We've talked about that in survival situations.
God, that'd be great. I think you guys should do that.
He told me he'd rather die than share a sleeping bag with somebody else.
You do that. We'll put a titties and 10 ring shirt on both of you, and you'll be Insta famous.
Yeah. Oh man. Cody, man, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm super stoked you came on, and anybody that's wanting to follow you, what's the easiest, where can people find you?
I spend most of my time on Instagram answering questions there. So they can hit me up there if they have questions, or if they want to see some of my studies. Most of my studies have been on the Push podcast, or I've covered some of them on CafaroCast. And you're going to see a tuning series with the Push pack, and also Broadhead and bow reviews that are all independent of marketing. And you need to make it clear to people that I paid full retail for yours, because now people are going to think I got your sticks because I did this podcast. I pay full retail for my stuff. I paid for those sticks, and it has nothing to do with this. And it's the same thing with my bow reviews. I pay retail, and I test them, and it's all fact-based.
Nice. I'm glad you brought that up. I wouldn't even bring up that you were a Timber Ninja customer. So I didn't want people to think I was pushing shit just from people that buy from me. No, yeah, I appreciate that support though. And we do here, because being a small company, we like it all, and we like good people using our stuff. And that's awesome that, you ponied up. Well, cool. I guess we'll end that tonight. I know you got a lot to do. You're packing up to go for a hunt. And once again, we appreciate everybody for listening. Hit the subscribe button on all these. Send me a check in the mail to buy some beer if you want to hear more of this, any of those types of things. But until next time, we're out.